Hello, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 8 today. It's very important as we look at Daniel that we realize, number one, God gave us these for a purpose. Now, there's two focus in God gave us Scripture. Number one, He gave it to the people of the day in which it was written. And that's what chapter 8 is certainly for. The Jewish people in the post-exilic period who are going to experience some terrible persecution under a Seleucid leader called Antiochus Epiphanes around 168 to 165 BC. Now, chapter 7 is given more of an end-time orientation, which is more for that generation following that to help us see the persecution that's going to come right before the end of the age, the birth pains of the Messianic age. Now, it's very important that we see that there is a set relationship in the flow of Daniel. Chapter 2 describes an image with a five-fold successive empires. There's the head of gold, which is Nebuchadnezzar, and then becomes the silver breast, which obviously is Medo-Persia. And then it becomes the leg of bronze, which seems to be Greece, Alexander the Great, and then the feet of iron and clay, which seems to be the Roman Empire, which will be destroyed by supernatural means and an eternal kingdom set up, which is the heaven or eternity with God. Now, chapter 7 parallels that. It's the lion with wings, it's the bear, it's the leopard with wings, and it's the beast that's so bad it's undescript. And then finally, at the end, we have this beautiful picture of the Son of Man receiving the kingdom. Now, chapter 8 focuses in on two aspects of those five kingdoms. It's going to focus in on the second and third. So it's going to focus in on Persia and Greece. Now, this section is primarily for the Jewish people. Now, I want to say a word to you about why it seems so unusual to us to have prophecy like this. First of all, the Old Testament only saw one coming of the Messiah. But we know from the New Testament that Jesus came twice, incarnated at Bethlehem, but coming again on the clouds of heaven as the King of Kings. He came first as Savior, He's coming as Judge. Well, that time gap is shortened in its Old Testament perspective. Now, I think we see this clearly in 1 John chapter 2, verse 18, where it talks about there are many antichrists in the world, but there is a coming, capital A, Antichrist. There's been much confusion about the Antichrist, the little horn mentioned in chapter 7 and the little horn mentioned in chapter 8. I believe it's the Antichrist with a capital A in chapter 7 and one of the Antichrists with a little a in chapter 8. Now, the reason I think that is, I think there's always been this spirit against God. Antiochus Epiphanes characterizes that spirit in the particular period of the Persian Empire. There have always been those kind of people, those kind of movements. It is going to be ultimately personified in the man of sin, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So I think the little horn of chapter 7 is the Antichrist, and the little horn of chapter 8 is a Antichrist. Now, remember that the little horn of 7 comes in the fourth kingdom, but the little horn of 8 comes in the third kingdom, if my designations are right. Now, we are told in chapter 8, verse 20 and 21, that the vision refers to Medo-Persia and Greece. It seems to fit the flow of 2, 7, and 8, that those kingdoms fit together like that. So I hope you'll follow with me as we go through chapter 8. In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, so we're 2 years after the vision of chapter 7, okay? The king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. Now, in the Hebrew here, Daniel's just surprised that he got another vision. He wasn't expecting the first one of chapter 7. Now, he had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's and other people's, but he was greatly honored that God would give him the vision of 7, and he was greatly honored, though it made him sick both times, to have the vision of chapter 8. Notice where it says, and I looked in a vision, it came about while I was looking that I was in the citadel of Susa. Now, this is very similar to Ezekiel chapter 8, where the prophet is caught up from Babylon by the river Kidar and transported to Jerusalem to see a vision. I do not believe Daniel was in Shushan or Susa, both go by the same name. It's the later summer capital of the coming kingdom of Medo-Persia. At this time, it was just a large city. It was not a capital of anything. It was not even in one of the major provinces of Babylon. And yet that's where Daniel finds himself. He recognized it. How? From pictures? We don't know. He's in the citadel or the castle of the stronghold of Susa, Shushan. Now, he realized he's by a river here. Notice it says, which is the province of Elam. He needed to tell people where it was in his day because they didn't know about this city. It wasn't famous yet. And I looked in the vision. I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Now, we know there's two different rivers this is called. We think this was the forming of the unity of the branch of two different rivers. We know from history it was 900 feet wide, a very large irrigation canal. Okay? Now, and I lifted up my gaze and looked, behold, a ram with two horns was standing in front of the canal. Now, the two horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up last. Well, obvious a vision because the horns, he's going to see them come out. Now, this seems to fit, and it's definitely told in verse 20. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. We know that the empire of Media came first and was more powerful, but that Persia, Cyrus, was more aggressive, and Persia became the dominant force. That's why we call the empire Persia. And so it fits history completely about these two aspects. It's the bear of chapter 7 with one side lifted up. Now notice where it says, now the two horn, verse 4. And I saw a ram budding westward, northward, and southward. Now this ram, of course, describes the directions that the Persian Empire invaded. Isn't it unusual that the east is not mentioned? We know from history that there was significant territorial gains in these different areas, particularly the south being Egypt, the north being Lydia, and the west, let's see, I've forgotten what the west is. Let me look back and see if I can find it a second. I mentioned it in the last chapter. Yeah, the west would be Babylon. Now, we know from history that there was no significant gains to the east until the later reign of Darius I Hystrapes, that would be 521 to 485 BC. And so it fits perfectly into the history that we know. Now, notice where it mentions here, some think this refers to the three ribs that the bear had in his mouth, the three directions of the compass, back in chapter 7, verse 5. Well, I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west. Now this, we learn from chapter 21, is Greece. And the conspicuous horn is going to be Alexander the Great. It fits geographically. Notice it's coming from the west. And that's exactly the way the Grecian Empire would come to the kingdom of Persia. Over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. This is the emphasis of speed that we have back in chapter 7, verse 6, with the leopard with 4 wings. Alexander conquered so swiftly the whole known world. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. This is Alexander the Third, that we commonly call Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedon. And he came up to the ram that had 2 horns, which was standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him with a mighty wrath. Notice verse 7. He was enraged at him. Now we know from history that the Greeks were so angry with the Persians. Under Darius III, Greece tried to cross the Hellespont 3 or 4 different times and invade Greece and were repulsed. It made the Greeks so mad that Persia was trying to dominate them. When Alexander finally crossed the Hellespont, and I think it's in 334 BC, with 34,000 troops, I think it's about 30,000 men and 5,000 cavalry, and he faced the Persian army. Now, the numbers may be slightly exaggerated, but it says in history 600,000 men. Alexander was such a military genius. His army was so well structured and planned that he routed this huge army 3 different times. When Darius tried to make a pact with him, Alexander said, "No way." Alexander was so angry that he destroyed Persia and would not compromise at all. Now, Notice what it says, and so he hurled him to the ground and trampled him, and Persia is eliminated from the scene of history. And there was none to rescue the ram from his, Alexander's, power. And the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. Now, because of the context of Daniel 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, this is not like the exceeding boastful braggadociousness of the little horns. This Hebrew idiom seems to mean he was very successful and his domain was very large. It doesn't mean he bragged that he was deity or flaunted himself against the God of Israel. That's not what this Hebrew idiom means here, although it does mean that in connection with a little horn that's going to come up later. Okay? And as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and its place came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. Now, here we have another strikingly detailed predictive prophecy. There are some who try to identify the little horn of chapter 7 and the little horn of chapter 8 because they believe it's too detailed of history and it must have been written down the Maccabean period to be so accurate. Others try to identify them because of their eschatological systems, particularly dispensational premillennialists, starting with Lindsay. Now, I think what we have here, in history we know that Alexander the Great was sad because the whole world was conquered. And apparently he died of a fever, a swamp fever, because he had lived such not only a fast-paced life, but apparently had some abuse of alcohol and was just a push kind of fella. And he died of the fever at 32 years old. Well, there are 5 Greek generals that in the period of 20 years fought over Alexander's empire. 4 of them became dominant. Let me give them to you if I could. Ptolemy in Egypt, Cassander in Greece, Seleucus in Syria and Babylon, Lysimachus in Thrace. Now there is an Antiochus the fourth, and I think it's Antigonus, which was part of Asia Minor, but lost the battle and was removed from power. So basically 4, and this fits so well, this predictive prophecy about the 4 horns. And out of one of them came a rather small horn that grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land, the promised land. This seems to fit the 8th Seleucid ruler known as Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Through cunning trickery, which is going to be depicted here in the text, he widened his empire into Egypt, into Babylon, and controlled the promised land. Now, the reason I think that he is particularly picked out as just one of the Seleucid rulers is because of the miseries that he caused the Jews. And we've switched to history in chapter 8. 2 through 7 describe the world empires and the consummation of God's sovereignty over history in the end time. But now, beginning in chapter 8, God's trying to prepare the Jewish people for a persecution that's going to occur before the Messiah comes, and we're switching back to Hebrew for them, and I think that's why we're focusing in on this particular ruler. Notice where it says in verse 10, "And he grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to earth, and it trampled them down." Now, this stars of heaven seems to be a way of talking about the people of God. We see it from Genesis 15:5, from Jeremiah 33:22, and from Daniel 12:3. And so what we have here is this man's success against the people of God. Now, notice, if you would, where it mentions here, "And he even magnified himself to be equal with the commander of the host." Now, this is a very similar phrase to Lord Sabaoth, which is a characteristic name of God in the post-exilic books. I think here it's referring to God. Okay? Not only the captain of the host, meaning the saints, but the word is also used of the angelic realm. And so it's a title for God. Now notice it says, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, meaning God, and placed and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. The idea is defiled. Now, this regular sacrifice, we know from verse 12, is the Hebrew word continually, which seems to refer to not only the sacrifice, but the regular offerings and incense burning and all of that of the temple. Now, we know this occurred around 168 BC, through where intrigue Antiochus got into Jerusalem. He stopped the regular Jewish feast days and the regular sacrifices. We even know that he set up an altar to Zeus in the place of the altar of incense in the holy place, and he offered a pig on the altar and forced Jews to eat the flesh of the pigs. Now the reason for this is he wanted to Hellenize the Jews. He was following the footsteps of Alexander the Great, and he was going to force it on them, and that's how much of this problem with the Jews came. Now, if you're familiar with the histories of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you'll know that this is where the priest of Modin rebelled, and his sons with him started a guerrilla warfare that finally cleansed the temple in 165, December of 165, which we know as the Feast of Lights or Purim, which is modern Hanukkah that the Jews have around our Christmas time. Now, a man we know is Judas Maccabeus, known as Judas the Hammer, and it started a whole system of intrigue that finally issues in Herod being on the throne in Jesus' day. Okay? Now, when it says here, on account of the transgression, now some have thought it means the Jewish sin, the rebellion, after the post-exilic period, allowed God to dominate them again by using Antiochus as his instrument of judgment, as he has previously used Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. But I really think, because of the Hebrew, it's referring to the sin of Antiochus Epiphanes. But we can't be sure. Notice it mentions the host again, which seems to be the people of God, over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling the truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. And this seems to refer to the period of domination of the Jewish people. Now, this period lasted about 6 or 7 years. It's very hard to go back in Maccabees and find certain dates that fit the exact dating of the book of Daniel. Okay, now, then I heard a holy one. Now, this seems to be an angel. One angel is asking another angel. This is usually the word saint, holy one, but it's got to be an angel here. Some think this relates to 1 Peter 1:12, where the angels longed to look into the plan of God. One angel understood, one angel didn't, one angel asked the other. But I'm not sure that fits really, because what we have here, the angels are speaking for the purpose of Daniel's hearing, not the curiosity of the angel. How long will this vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? How long is this going to last, this domination by this Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, here is the answer in verse 14. And I wish it was much more clear, but it's a little ambiguous. It's apocalyptic language. And he said to me, for 2,300 evening and mornings, and the holy place will be properly restored. Well, evening and morning seem to refer to the sacrificial system, the morning and evening sacrifices, or go back to Genesis where day begins in the evening and then goes to the morning. Now the question has been, is it 6 years, 110 days, or is it 3.5 years? Do you take each one as separately, or do you take them as one day? Boy, I'm in a pickle here. There are many other dates in Daniel 7 through 12 that seem to imply the 3.5 years. And because this can mean that, I'm attracted to it. Historically, in the Maccabean period, there is a 6-year and a third period of the domination of Antiochus Epiphanes over the Jews. Neither one of them really fits the historical facts of Maccabees as we understand them. So I must admit, I just do not know. I want to say the 7 years, but I'm pulled toward the 3.5 because of other numbers in this prophetic apocalyptic section of Daniel. Now, obviously this was restored in 165 A.D. I believe it's December 12th. And it came about that I, seen these visions that I had sought, understood it. Behold, standing before me was one like a man. Now, obviously an angel. Angels appear as men. And this one's going to be named. I heard a voice of a man between the banks of the Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man understanding of the vision. Now this seems to be the voice of God commanding Gabriel. There are only 2 angels named in the Bible, Gabriel and Michael. Both of them appear in Daniel. Gabriel appears in the Gospels. Daniel appears in Jude. Michael appears in Jude. Now, Daniel seems to mean man of God. He seems to be the messenger angel because he is mentioned in Luke 1:19 and Luke 1:26. He brings the message to Elizabeth. He brings the message to Mary. He is also mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, verse 27, later in the book. Verse 21. Now, Michael is also mentioned later as the guardian angel of Israel. Many think that Michael is the pre-incarnate Jesus. I'm not sure that's true. That is the only angels mentioned, and they both appear as a man. They're not cherubs. They're not seraphim. They seem to appear as a man. Some have called them archangels. We're not sure of that, except Michael is called an archangel. So he came near where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. That's always what men do in the presence of the supernatural realm. John did that on the island of Patmos. Ezekiel did that in his vision of Jerusalem. It just scares the hound out of him. God's characteristic word to man when he breaks into his life is, fear not. And boy, I can understand that. To deliver me from angels popping in and out of my understanding. But he said to me, Son of man. Now, isn't this unusual? Now, look at your verse 17. Mine has it capitalized. I don't know why it's capitalized. It's simply saying human being. The usage here is like the book of Ezekiel. This is not a title for the Messiah, like back in chapter 7, verse 13. It simply should be a little less. And it's not Ben Adam, it's Ben Enosh, which means frail man. Okay? Understand the vision pertains to the end of the time of the end. Now this doesn't mean it's what we would think as the end of the world. It refers to the end of the period of transgression of the Jewish people under Antiochus IV. Now notice in verse 18 that Daniel sinks down and has to be woke up, and it's something. He just loses touch here physically. Then he said, Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur in the final period of the indignation. This means the wrath of God. This is used several times, this word indignation, throughout the Old Testament. I've listed it in your outline the several places it's used. Now, some think it refers to the exile. Some think it refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, and some think it refers to the Great Tribulation of the end time. Well, let me say to you again, knowing Old Testament prophecy, it could refer to any of those or all of those. Remember how the historical foreshadowing occurs? A contemporary event is used to describe a future event and ultimately an end-time event. Well, that's so common that it could be either one of those. For it pertains to the appointed time of an end. This same phrase is used in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3 for Babylonian destruction. So, whatever. The ram is Medo-Persia. Notice that in verse 20. Well, why use the ram? Well, it was the sign of the zodiac, Aries, that was used for the nation of Persia. We also know that the guardian spirit of Persia was a ram. We know that when they went out in battle, they had a ram on their shields. So it's an obvious symbol. The nations today have animal symbols. A bear for Russia, an eagle for the United States, a lion for England, and so on. So it's a common thing. Now the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. That's verse 21. We note the sign of the zodiac was Capricorn for Greece. And we also know that on the Macedonian coat of arms was a sign of a shaggy male goat. And so it seems to fit history that these were the two symbols used. We have the same interpretation coming that I've already given you, and Daniel was being explained this by the angel. Obviously, God did not give this for such confusion. He gave it for the people of Israel to understand a future persecution. That is going to be a historical foreshadowing of the ultimate persecution that we call the tribulation period that will happen to the people of God before the second coming of the Messiah. Now, I know all this is confusing, and we've got to kind of link this together, but be very careful when you do, because sometimes we get more dogmatic over our systems than we do of the Bible. The Bible is ambiguous. The Bible is in apocalyptic literature. The Bible, I believe, does not have a systematic eschatology, though it does give us true glimpses of what will happen to prepare the people of God. It's amazing to me that every generation tries to fit all of these into their day. I think they're going to historically fit perfectly the last generation, and we need to quit being so selfish about making all the Bible apply to us. It had a meaning to its day. It has a meaning to us. It'll have a meaning to the end generation. Now, notice in verse 23, this Antiochus Epiphanes is described in greater detail as a very tricky kind of person. He's going to win his power by intrigue and subtlety and craftiness, and God's going to let him do it. And that's what's going to be amazing. And you see that both in 23 and 24. Now, if you want to see the history of this, you ought to get 1 Maccabees and read chapter 1, verses 29 through 41, chapter 1, verses 44 through 50, and chapter 4, 4, verses 38 and 39. This describes some of this intrigue connected with the takeover of Jerusalem and some of his other conquests. First, the books of Maccabees have some excellent history of the inter-biblical period and ought to be read not for inspired doctrine, but for the history of the day that prepares the scene for the ministry of Jesus in Galilee and Perea and Judea. Now, in verse 27, it wiped Daniel plumb out. It was just like chapter 7. I don't know about you. When I study some of these apocalyptic passages, I love the Bible so much. I want to take it so seriously. I'm a historical grammatical exegete, which means I want to take it literally. I want to see how it fits in history. I'm committed to its literalness. But I get sick at my stomach trying to fit all this together. And I can't do it. I want to know what God's saying, yet I have such great problems. I pray and study and compare and look up parallels and struggle with the context and try to get the etymology of words and look at the history of the day. And I must admit to you, the more I try to put Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, the book of the Revelation together, I don't feel better, I feel worse. Because I think all the systems, including my own, tend to twist or force or ignore parts of the Word of God. Friends, I want to say to you, Jesus is coming back again physically. This was given to us for a purpose. To know that God is sovereign. He's in control of history. He's shown us some things that are going to happen, so when the persecution falls on the church, and I believe the people of God will go through the tribulation. I'm post-trib. I believe they'll know that God's... And that's why God gave it to the Jews. They went through the tribulation of this Antiochus Epiphanes, so God would know. I mean, they would know that God's with them. I think He's done the same thing in some of this for the church. I wish I had a more clear answer, but to tell you the truth, the more I study, the more I feel uncomfortable with dogmatic eschatology of anybody's system. The Bible will throw a lot of light on commentaries if you let the Bible be the only guide for faith and practice. I've enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.